And I would love to see it become more and more normalized over time that inclusive just means for everybody. The people who are usually the least centered, if we adapt the classes to them, everybody wins. We actually can't create truly safe spaces, but what we can create are brave spaces.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today's topic is one that's foundational to how we approach movement at Heart and Bones: how to teach inclusive yoga classes. I'm Ula, part of the Heart and Bones team, where I support content and strategy, and I'm also a yoga teacher myself. I'm sitting down with Brea Johnson, founder of Heart and Bones Yoga and longtime champion of accessible anatomy-informed movement. We're going to be talking about what inclusivity actually means in the yoga space, not just as a buzzword, but as a real lived teaching skill, from physical cues to cultural considerations, from accessibility to agency. We're going to really dig into what it looks like to create classes where everyone feels seen and supported. We're also doing a very fun upcoming podcast and series I want your submissions for. I think Brea and I both want them, obviously. But hey, if you have a wild yoga teaching story, we really want to hear about it. I'm going to include a link in the description to submit your story. So think bodily functions, accidental cult, worst subbing story, and retreat from hell. Please click the link in the bio description. Please click the link in the description and spill the tea. Okay, and before we jump into the rest of the podcast, always a good quick reminder is if you're thinking about becoming a yoga teacher or evolving your teaching, our 200 and 300 hour online trainings are open for enrollment this fall. They're flexible, global, and built for real-world teaching. And if you want to explore our inclusive teaching in action, you can try out Heart and Bones Studio for $1 this month. That's full access to all of our classes and playlists, including chair yoga, mobility, strength, and programs designed for all bodies. Okay, Brea, let's get into it. Inclusive yoga is a phrase we hear a lot. What does that actually mean to you?
Well, I'm glad it's a phrase we hear a lot. I hope in people's worlds, it's a phrase we're hearing more and more. Inclusive yoga can, I think, mean a lot of things. And I hope it's an obvious word for a lot of us. So when we think of inclusive, are we thinking also who's excluded? What's not inclusive? And I think it's important to have the word inclusive. And what it means for me is really looking at what popular yoga culture has excluded for a long time. And we're bringing in the included, those who were excluded, into a little bit more inclusivity. So people who have different ranges of motion and ability, people who we don't predominantly see in yoga classes, different populations of people. Really, I think it's just inclusive yoga is like, how can we have this beautiful ancient wisdom tradition practice from India here in modern times? How do we make it so that it really truly works for everybody and everybody? Or I think it's also the word accessible yoga too, which of course, and rightly so, should be talking about people who regular mainstream yoga classes and studios are inaccessible to them, whether it's due to them being in a wheelchair, them just like a multitude of reasons. But you're right, then the able-bodied people tend to think that then this isn't a class for me. And I would love to see it become more and more normalized over time that inclusive just means for everybody. And sure, let's say you can get your head on your knees and your fingers to your toes, and a chair class and these props are actually going to enhance you no matter what your ability is. In fact, when we center, one of the things that I talk a lot about in our teacher trainings, for example, is when we set around inclusivity and accessibility, when we center our classes as best we can in the context and place that we're in, so that we are bringing the people who are usually the least centered, if we adapt the classes to them, everybody wins. An example of this that really struck for me, years ago, we used to run yoga retreats in Iceland. And one of the places that we stayed in Iceland, and I actually don't remember the name of it offhand, so I'm sorry to anybody listening, was this place where it was all about accessibility and people with different abilities. So this place in Iceland was really focused on people who are differently abled and different disabilities. But the thing is that everybody who was able-bodied had to adapt to everybody who had the different abilities, and they were centered. And so rather than, our world where it's able-bodied focused and centered and everybody else has to adapt, whether you're neurodivergent or if you have different abilities physically, mentally, and whatnot, this place where it was that was all shifted around. And it was really interesting to see and really left in profound impact. And I think another example of that sometimes with wheelchair curbs. So the curbs on the street, of course, were, I believe, originally designed so that people in wheelchairs could get off the curb when they're on the street, right? But then the beautiful thing when we center that, because not everybody is in a wheelchair, and an able-bodied person can walk and step off the curb generally pretty okay. But when we had prioritized that, then that means people on bikes, people with walkers, people who, whatever, baby carriages, just like it actually works for everybody. And so when we have that principle of, when we bring the least prioritized in our dominant culture into more prioritized, it's a win-win for all. And so can we do that in our classes? And with the caveat that we may not be able to do fully accessible for every single person in every class for a lot of different reasons, but can we make it more so? Can we have that as part of our intention as teachers?
That's so great. I'm glad you said maybe we can't solve for 100% of people, but we can do the best that we can in that moment and for that student and just create that environment. What are some of the common assumptions teachers make about who their class is for, and how do those assumptions limit accessibility?
I think there's a layer of unconscious assumptions. So I'm going to use the word mainstream here. When I use the word mainstream, what I'm referring to is our popularized version of yoga. And when I say popularized version of yoga, I'm talking about like whatever popular yoga studio that has like a flow class and this class and and they're really truly geared to more able-bodied people. And, we're going to do this pose and we're going to do that. And it's just, so I hope everybody kind of gets what I mean when I say mainstream yoga, because I think it's a fair point that most mainstream yoga is this. And so let's say you do your yoga teacher training in a mainstream approach where it's like maybe there's adaptability or accessibility is not talked about in your training, or it's just barely touched on as sort of like an add-on, like pregnancy yoga is, right? But everything else is geared towards relatively able-bodied people. And so you already have, I think, an unconscious story of who can do yoga, because that's what you've been taught. That's what you see in the classes. That's what you see in most studios is fairly like healthy, able-bodied people. And so we just assume this is what yoga is. So I think first and foremost, there's that unconscious assumption that most teachers or a lot of teachers might have. And then they go and they start teaching all sorts of different bodies who are coming into their class. And just like teaching in a way that there's this assumption that, everybody can do the thing. Oh, and if you can't do the thing, grab a block. If you can't do this, don't do it. Go into child's pose, right? Like there's this kind of like throwaway feeling. And I think that's sort of the assumptions. And it takes some unlearning. And I think for a lot of teachers, it also takes their own injuries or their own experience with a loved one or family member who they're like enthusiastically teaching for the first time and then going, okay, this person that I'm teaching can't do the thing and I don't know what to do. And then they start getting interested in inclusive approaches.
What do you think is the difference between a class that's truly inclusive versus one that is just using inclusive language?
I think there's layers to this question, maybe, because it's easy to talk the talk and it's another thing to walk the walk. And I think there's layers because in a lot of cases, we can't be inclusive to everybody. Depending, again, as we mentioned briefly. I think in a previous episode, I mentioned about my old yoga studio was upstairs in an old building. There was no elevator. It just wasn't fundamentally, the location was fundamentally not inclusive to everybody. So I could have had the language, oh, we're inclusive. And it's like inclusive to a point. And then we also have these layers of the socioeconomic inclusivity. Yeah, we're an inclusive yoga studio, but sorry, most people can't afford our whatever prices. Like culture and community, you know, a lot of times here in depending where you live, like who's not in your classes? You know, like, are you a lot of like young 20-year-old healthy white people? And who else isn't there? Are there older people? Like, there's just so many layers of what inclusivity actually means. And I think once we start to open our eyes to that, it's important. So we can say the thing. And so that's why I try not to, for myself, knowing all of that, that just like there's sometimes when we talk about like a safe space, like, oh, I'm creating a safe space in our classes. But a lot of dialogue around that is actually like, well, we actually can't create truly safe spaces, but what we can create are brave spaces, spaces where we can make mistakes and fumble and not do it perfectly. And I'd like to extend that here, maybe when it comes to inclusivity and accessibility, that there's so many layers that are actually potentially quite challenging depending on what they are and where you are in the world. And if you're just, you know, one teacher who teaches one class a week at one studio, like there's sometimes like the impact that we want to have will be challenging. So we do steps towards making it more inclusive. Maybe there's ways that you can financially create like some scholarships or a pay what you can model. And that might work for economic inclusivity. Okay, you're at that studio where it has stairs. Okay, so can you as a teacher go to a studio, or you as a teacher go to a space where it is more accessible and you can let people or people with like in wheelchairs or mobility issues can come and attend the class a little bit easier than the studio with a stair. So we have to get a little bit more creative around the inclusivity. And then I think the very first baby steps towards inclusivity is also just like, what's the vibe in the yoga studio? What energy are you creating? I don't know about you, but I have been to too many yoga studios and yoga spaces where I feel like I'm not good enough. I'm not wearing the right clothes. I can't do the right poses. The teachers are like really clicky feeling, you know, and oh my God, does that just get my like back up? Maybe it's just old vibes from like high school feeling, you know, like it just like that kind of thing, that inherently is not inclusive. So can we at the bare minimum have people feel welcome and try to learn everybody's names, you know, like not just have this like clicky yoga feeling that anybody who's not already been there feels like they're on the outside. That's step one on inclusivity.
I want to get into some of the practical stuff. What are some practical ways that teachers can make their classes physically accessible to, you know, a range of bodies, injuries, mobility levels?
Props. Props, all the props, do the props. Yeah, it really, truly, because, and within that, centering props. So as we talked about already, when we're centering the people who are less able-bodied, all bodies win from that. And so when we're as teachers just going, okay, if you can't do this, grab this prop, like, or if you're a beginner, grab this, like, it's just all these sort of like words and ways of saying things that really just create a hierarchy towards the able-bodied folks. And so for me as a teacher, I make with love. We all okay. We can leave that in as a blooper if it works. With kindness, I do make people grab a block. There's no choice. It's like everybody grab a block. There's no ifs, ands, or buts with kindness. Everybody's grabbing a block. Everybody's going to benefit from the way that I'm teaching this with the block. It's not because we don't, in my classes and in this anatomy informed approach, we don't use blocks as add-ons, as like, oh, let's bring the floor up to you. No, we are using the props as ways to get more activated in the joints and muscles. We're using the props to get more focused on a certain type of balance or movement or whatnot. Props are so good. And so we celebrate and we prioritize props and we normalize it. We don't make it as, again, having that hierarchical language, I think is so important as a teacher, or teachers who are like, oh, I don't demo shit. So I'm swearing a little bit on this because I get very charged up a little bit. I don't demo stuff. Obviously, if you take my online classes, I'm doing the class with you because that's just the way it works for online. But anything in person, I rarely demo it. And I very intentionally do not demo quote advanced versions of anything. Not that I can do a ton of the advanced stuff, like whatever that might mean. But sure, even if I could do, okay, here's option A, B, and C, choose your adventure. Like those are some of the language that I use as a teacher, like choose your own adventure. I'm not hierarchaling. I know that's not a word. I'm not placing a hierarchy on which option people choose. And I'm not just defaulting into showing the more challenging physical version to show off or just to even show it as an option. Because I have seen in my experience as a teacher, anytime you show that version, the people whose bodies aren't necessarily able to do it well will just, some people will just do it because it's like, oh, I want to try that, and fine, fun. But I don't even just show it. I don't even show it. I'm just like, hey, you try this, do that, and there's no story around it being like just creating that hierarchy in a class.
So, how do you create a class then that feels safe and supportive without needing to know every student's diagnosis or story? And I know we, on a past episode of Yoga Teacher Hotline, you talked about even, knowing your role as a teacher. And so for me, when I think about like past experience, it's like people will come up to you and tell you their story, and also sometimes people will never tell you, so you kind of have to figure it out.
Yeah, that's a tricky one for sure. So go back to the Yoga Teacher Hotline and watch that answer for a little bit more in depth on that version. But I think the short answer would be I don't really ask about injuries for like a lot of reasons anymore because it's out of scope. Like you said, some people might not ever say anything, or somebody else still might. And I pause because there is still a time and place sometimes where we can talk about injuries. But the main general feeling, unless I'm teaching a class to very specific populations, I'm going to think that most people are relatively healthy enough in their movement that they can do some of the stuff, if not all of the stuff that I'm sharing, because the foundation of what I teach is this anatomy informed approach. And that means that we are not going into deep ranges of motion. We aren't doing things that are going to potentially like, I'm pausing because I can see how tempting it is to go into some hierarchical language right now about this, where I'm in comparing mode of like, well, mainstream yoga is going to hurt you. This yoga is not. And that's not what I'm trying to say at all. But there's a difference of a mindful mobility way and proprioceptive way of this anatomy informed yoga that just sort of fundamentally creates a safe container and boundaries and functionality in the way that we approach our movement and asana, that just in itself makes the classes more accessible and inclusive and a little bit more supportive for all bodies. So just know that when you're teaching things in a more activated, functional, mindful way of movement, like an anatomy informed approach, that alone, boom, done, already better. But then this is a huge part of it, is playfulness and curiosity. If we can create classes that encourage curiosity and playfulness, and researchers can back this up so much. When we are engaged in play, we are more confident. We are ready to take more like healthy risks. The way the brain fires is in a really functional, happy, supportive way for the nervous system and our movement, because we're not trying to, because I think in uninclusive classes are going back into that hierarchical teaching and this thing of performance and perfection. So when we're in a class that is focused on getting a pose really right, when we're in a class where we have to look really good in it, when we're in a class where we're being micromanaged by our teacher, giving a 10 million cues so that we look a certain way, what happens? We lose playfulness. We move into performance. We lose the connection to our own expansive inner wisdom and somatic body knowing. And we try to go back again into performance and perfection. So when we can let that as teachers go and be like, hey, what if we, so instead of as a cue, instead of being like, everybody step your right foot forward, da, da, da. I say cues like that. I'm not saying this is bad, but when it's all sort of that micromanagey, uh, drill sergeanty, and I know so many teachers aren't actual drill sergeants, and this I'm using dramatic examples here, but that sort of like very instructive, directive language, it's a different experience in the nervous system and then in the entire class vibe than, hey, everybody, what if you just tried this? What if you stepped your foot forward, brought your other leg here, and did blah, 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 right? Like, so it's like this, like when you're doing some of your cues in this curiosity way of like, what if we tried this? What happens when you do that? And then people are like, yeah, what does happen? Because then you're not, as the teacher, setting up the expectation that somebody has to perform a pose perfectly. It's like, hey, try this. Did that work? No? Okay, try that. Did that work? No. Okay, fun. Who cares? None of it matters. Like, that's kind of what I mean with this playfulness and lack of performance. And then everybody's smiling more. I'll share one of my favorite ways of doing this is actually often in balancing poses. So like always for over 2 decades of my teaching, this is pretty consistent. When we teach a balancing pose, everybody starts I see the vibe of the room completely shift, and it starts getting like closed off and stiff, the energy of the room. And then people's foreheads are furrowing, and they're like, because we're balancing, right? We need to concentrate. And so I'm watching it and I'm laughing. And then I let it happen on the one side. And then before we go to the other side, I say, hey, okay, did everybody notice how focused you were? And they're like, oh yeah, I was. I'm like, great, I love your focus. It was good. It was the right response. But now let's pause for the next time. And sometimes I'll use cues like, okay, now picture you're going to do the next side like you were 4 years old. How would a 4-year-old do this balance? And everybody, like, you immediately see them just loosen right up, and they're like, oh yeah, ha ha ha. And like, as a 4-year-old doesn't care. A 4-year-old is like, wee, let's try this. Or we'll do a different way of getting into it and be like, and I'll tell them, okay, now do the next side as if it didn't matter. And everybody laughs as well, because they all went into like performance mode, just default, because it's a balance. And so as teachers, if we can sort of enhance our classes in that way too, of like a before and after, you just see the room vibe and energy change. And it's just like people are looser on the other side. They're smiling. I'm reminding them, none of this matters. You're just standing on one foot. And they're like, ha ha ha, yay. And then it's just so much more impactful in the end.
Now, maybe you don't have experience with this. I'm just gonna like toss this out. I know in our studio we do have chair classes. I've never had an experience as a teacher where I had a student come in that did require a chair during like a regular class. I was wondering, is there a way that I can approach offering choices to make sure that the other person doesn't feel othered if they did want to perhaps use a chair or modify? And so this is kind of going beyond the yoga block, right? Like beyond the yoga block, like I'm comfortable with that one, but I can see, or perhaps I feel like I need to make it easier. Is there any advice?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think as so much of it you probably don't get a lot of people who would need a chair in your average class, because hopefully we've all described our classes appropriately, so that acts as a filter. So, okay, fine. If you're teaching a hardcore vinyasa flow, we know, and it's in the description, somebody who needs a chair probably will understand that that's not the class for them. And that's fine. That's fine. You've created a boundary. That's a healthy boundary that people know what to expect in the class. So you don't have to fully adapt. But let's say somebody did still walk in your flow class, or maybe in your description, you're like, yes, everybody's welcome. And for the most part, you get relatively able-bodied people. And then somebody comes in and, as Ula said, really challenges that assumption of like, oh, wait, okay, right, everybody's welcome, and this person needs a chair. Hopefully there's a chair. I remember, so Kat, my co-teacher in the teacher training, she was recently teaching and so she's 55 and has had a knee thing, and she was teaching all day in a teacher training at a studio, and she was like, I actually need to be sitting in a chair. I can't sit on the ground anymore with my knee injury. And there was no chair, even at the yoga, like literally not one chair at the yoga studio. And Kat was just like raga raga after, because fair, right? Like, so that just shows again that what I was talking about earlier, of that unconscious assumption that everybody who's going to come here is able-bodied, so that hopefully, like, even the front desk didn't have a chair. Wild, wild. So hopefully there's a chair.
Step
Let's
one.
assume there is. Step one, have some chairs. And let's just say there's one chair, right? Because in some ways my mind goes immediately to like, everybody grab a chair. Okay, we're going to shift this class a little bit and we're going to have tons of fun. And so this is where, again, we're centering in a nice supportive way, not in a like, oh, everybody, we got to change. It's like, hey, let's try a chair. Everybody, we're all going to grab chairs today and we're going to have so much fun exploring these chair movements. Like, so you're like making it not a deal and you're enthusiastically encouraging it and normalizing it is one option. Maybe no, there's not enough chairs for everybody. The easiest thing that we can do is just make it not a big deal, not just like, okay, everybody, you do this, here's the things, and now Brenda, you have to do this, and you go like so you're not like fully, as you said, othering the other person, and just normalize. When I'm teaching online, let's say doing a live class, and I know some people are in a chair, I'll go, and okay, so if you're in a chair, you're going to do it like just like this. If you're not in a chair, do this. So again, you're like really not making it a big deal, but you're still offering the options for everybody. So I hope that answers that a little bit.
It's 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 funny because you're like, a have a chair, and I was like, right. Honestly, I think as a teacher that has some experience teaching, um, if I was like, yeah, here's a chair, I think in the moment, because if I am playful and open, I could actually probably adapt quite easily without making it a big deal. Um, Even just having some folding chairs available tucked away to the side with the props, just like literally in the room. A folding chair is not that hard to, put against a wall in a studio. And it automatically kind of going back to that, you're sending a signal by having chairs in the room. You're sending a signal that people are welcome to use chairs, and that is a valid prop to be using in a yoga class, versus having to like dig through the closet or go steal a chair from the front desk. A folding chair is not that hard to have. I know for myself, in one of my meditation trainings, chairs were like encouraged because we're actually sitting for such long periods of time. So even for like able-bodied people, sitting like certain postures for long periods of time, and they had full-blown folded chairs, but also like I call them kind of like the festival chair, where it's just like a back support. That alone could be really useful for someone who needs that like a little bit of that core support. All really good tips.
It goes back to that core reframe of centering the less abled person so that everybody wins. Because I think what you're making is such a good point. Like, okay, sure, I have a body that could sit in a teacher training lecture for 3 hours, fine. Like, and I'd be okay-ish. But I also know the minute I have that little festival chair or something, I'm like, oh, okay, I could sit up, but actually this just feels better. But like, so everybody wins when we make it things just more fundamentally accessible. Yeah. Well, and there's one example too that I think that might be also realistic for people is, if you're doing back to that balance example, when you're doing balancing poses, inevitably in the average class, there's going to be somebody who's really being challenged, and I don't want them to feel left out. So I'll say, historically, I would tell them, hey, you can use, I'll be like, not to them specifically, I say to the class, I'm like, okay, we've got options. If you're finding this challenging, head over to the wall. The wall is, and I'm like the salesperson where I'm like, the wall is such a great prop, it's so much fun. But I still watch the self-consciousness that seems to come out, because that might just be like, let's say there's 20 people in the class, 2 people really do need that wall. That means in the middle of the pose, they have to walk wherever they are in the room out of their spot to that wall. That's for some people, that's not comfortable. And so, and I've seen this happen so many times that I'm just like, okay, whoops, I said that during the class. I can see that person doesn't really want to do that. Okay, we're going to finish this pose. And then if we've got another yoga balance, then I go, okay, everybody, we're going to the wall. So again, it's that same like normalization. And then the people who didn't really need the wall, quote, quote, goes to the wall and goes, oh, damn, that was way better. Right? So again, everybody wins.
Okay, let's talk about agency and what does it mean to center agency in your class? How do you encourage students to make choices without framing one option as being better?
Well, I think we've already covered that in different ways throughout this conversation. So I would throw in agency because I love that word. I think that's a really great, like, agency is autonomy, is our own sense of self. And it goes back to what I was saying around this, like, type of yoga where it's like, do this, do that, no, 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 step your right, no, 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 like, where it's very directive and we're all in a choreography in a way, right? It's like, now we all have to do and perform. Agency as a teacher is an invitation for people. So the word invitation comes to me. So if we can bring in invitational language, what I said before with, like, hey, what if you did that? What does it feel like when we try this? Even using not just you, but we. I use the, like, really using us and including myself in that. Agency is another, like, we're, as teachers, we're mirroring things for people. So that's why being intentional with not doing the most dramatic advanced version of the pose and not even maybe showing it, because those who know how to do it would do it, right? And so you're mirroring agency for people that is perfectly okay. You, in terms of a power dynamic, this is another thing we haven't quite talked about in terms of inclusive classes. The power dynamic, you as the teacher, as the role of the authority, people are going to consciously or unconsciously put that authority onto you. So when you're mirroring back to them, it doesn't matter. This is just yoga. This is your place where it's safe to make mistakes. This is a place where it's safe to play and explore and see what happens. What do we want to do? I'm just your guide. I'm here to help us all. And then, like, again, I always just use balancing as such a good example for so many things, is showing, like, you as the teacher falling out of the pose when you're demoing it. That's inclusive, right? Because we're evening the playing field. We're not being like the all-knowing teacher. Again, hierarchy, these power dynamics, they show up in so many ways. And when we can be aware of them as teachers, that too is breaking down and breaking up that sense of inclusive or disinclusivity, if that's an official word. But anyway, it is now. But really, it is just like, what does it feel like? Because what is this practice of yoga? This isn't a performance. It's about like we can use the physical side of the yoga practice as a place of the deeper yoga practice, which is the practice of self-awareness. So inclusivity is fundamentally, when we're doing this practice of yoga, all about creating agency, because the practice of yoga is self-awareness. And when we as teachers are creating spaces that I'm, as the role of the teacher, I'm taking your agency away from you, I'm directing you, like, and please don't get me wrong, directive teaching is still helpful. I can be very direct as a teacher, right? Where it's like, yes, let's all step our right foot forward. But even just that, the fact that I just said, let's all, instead of step your right foot forward, it's kind of a subtle, because like, when I say let's all put our right foot forward, it's a little bit more on a subtle level inclusive than put your right foot forward. Because then I go into, like, performance, following the choreography now. And so agency and the practice of yoga is all about the somatic exploration of self. What does it feel like in my body? What does this movement feel like? So again, that curiosity and playfulness. So I don't know, I'm here to just help and guide as a teacher, and I hope that's what we are as well. I don't need to be the star. I'm not the boss. I'm not the guru. I'm not the director of your body and life. So if we can fundamentally have that as our goal as teachers and as our intention as teachers, that's an incredible place to start in terms of thinking about inclusive classes.
I really appreciate that we're sitting down and talk about this because I think it can feel like a sensitive topic, like if you don't know where to start. So, as a teacher that, I assume as someone that is a teacher, they want to evolve and continue learning and growing. And how do you think you can keep evolving as a teacher without getting kind of stuck in the fear of doing it wrong?
I would say apply the same principles that we've been talking about to yourself as a teacher, not just in your classes. Like, so yes, we identified playful curiosity is important. Well, bring playfulness and curiosity to yourself as a teacher. Am I getting too serious about it? Am I feeling like I need to perform as a teacher, right? Am I feeling like I need to be the perfect teacher? It's the same mirror. It's the same thing that if we're trying to create spaces in our classes and for people, that they don't have to feel that. Don't put that on yourself. Oh, shoot, I said the wrong pose, or oh, crap, I forgot one side. Hello, been there, done that millions of times. Whoops, oh, well, I'm still human, right? And then, so you're like your yoga becomes your yoga. And as we said, like, you will make mistakes. So it's okay. You will, anytime we're doing any sort of deconstructive work, meaning we're deconstructing the paradigms, the stories, the internalized beliefs, behaviors from our culture, from our families of origin, from our life, all these things about that we thought were supposed to be this way, our internalized just stuff. When we can bring awareness to it, it's going to feel a little uncomfortable. It's going to feel messy. It's going to feel like, oh, crap, I said that to that thing, that one person, that one time, and they probably thought I was a total jerk. And maybe they did. But we know we don't do better until we know better. And so we have to just keep learning and stay curious about it. My God, I guarantee I have said ridiculous stuff that I hope everybody has ever forgotten about, but maybe not. Maybe there's somebody out there that's like, oh my God, Brea was such a jerk. Okay, I maybe was. Because there's also that sense of like intention versus impact. That wasn't my intention, but I didn't know better at the time. And so it left an impact. And this is part of us being human. And in this world, and let's just take this outside of the yoga space. It's a microcosm of this, but in the macrocosm, these perfectionist supremacy cultural systems that we live in force us to have to perform. And there is hierarchy, and that just shows up in our yoga classes. And so for us to deconstruct and decolonize that, it just takes work. It takes practice. It takes messing up. It takes being brave about it. Okay. So we got this, friends. We can do this. We can do this. Inclusivity for the win.
The last thing I wanted to end on was kind of advice for newer teachers, but I feel like you've kind of answered that. You know, I wanted to kind of end on like, you know, if you're a new teacher and you want to be more inclusive and you don't know where to start, where's like one little thing that they could do for the next class?
This is a great question. This is a really, because I really love, because I know sometimes we can hear these podcasts or whatnot, or you're like so inspired now, maybe, hopefully, as you're listening and you're like, yes, I'm going to change everything and overhaul. Never a good idea, my friends. Like, yes, let's make changes, but we need 10% changes, just little steps. So that's such a good question, Ula. So one little step is, what if you played around with centering and prioritizing props? And how about not just props in general? How about make it even easier on yourself and make it explore? Don't change anything in your class from what you normally do, your sequences, what everything. But then and let's say where you historically had people do a low lunge, and you would sometimes give the cue, hey, if you need to, grab 2 blocks to put under your hand. And so what if instead of saying that, you go, hey, everybody, grab 2 blocks, put them underneath your hands in this lunge. And then now if you're a teacher going like, well, okay, great, but then why did I make everybody do that? Then I'll give you a little bit more. And then if it was me, then I would go, okay, note it. Let's use the hands on the blocks and just play around. Notice what that feels like when you have the blocks there, to give your arms a little bit more length from the ground, which gives your hips a little bit more. So as a teacher, I'm kind of selling it to them in a very like curiosity way. Like, notice what happens. How does it feel? Notice that you're probably not dumping down in your upper body, that you can notice with the hands underneath your blocks underneath your hand, you're able to elongate your spine a little easier. So you maybe can give them a reason why you do the blocks, but I would just switch and just go, hey, instead of giving an option, do one pose. Everybody try it. And then you can just keep repeating that in as many classes as you need to until you feel more confident to add more, another 10% and another 10%.
Okay, thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Please don't forget to leave your wild yoga teaching stories. The link is going to be in the description. And if this episode sparked some ideas or you realize, hey, I want to unlearn something, we'd love to hear from you. Always don't hesitate to reach out. We also are going to be running our 200 and 300 hour teacher training this fall. So they're full of thoughtful, kind, inclusive approaches built into every module. And of course, you can try Heart and Bone Studio for $1 as well, which will be, coupon code will be in the description for you. So thank you so much, Brea. What am I even saying?
That's so cute. Indy's like, Jesus Christ, I need a walk. This has been so, okay, we're wrapping it up. We're wrapping it up, Indy. I get it.